There's always been something sinister hiding under the layers of the dark ages of Britain. Perhaps because of the harsh living conditions of plague, intolerance, and having to wade through sewage-infested streets that gives the dark ages such a sinister vibe. Or maybe it was the fierceness of which religion was adopted and employed, or the way in which kings and queens towered over their people, ruling them with absoluteness. The torture of suspected witches also springs to mind when we think about the Dark Ages, where a confession was usually the only way to put an end to the misery of having your body mutilated. Amongst all this though, there appears to be a certain magic, whether malevolent or not, peppered throughout the many tales from the Dark Ages. We hear of practitioners of the dark arts, ill-intentioned covens, supernatural folk with unexplainable powers, werewolves, vampires, and the list goes on. One group of entities that appears to be often touched upon in British folklore are fairies. But fairies weren't always considered to be fictional characters, and maybe they aren't, according to some witch trials from Scotland. In some of these trials, we see the mention of the Queen of Elfame, the ruler of all fairies and the chairwoman of the fairies of Fordon Hill, where a supposed fairy court was often held. The Queen of Elfame and her fairies appear in a few witch trials by where she is portrayed as both benign and villainous in nature, or at least incompatible with the church, given her frequent associations with Satan. One of the first appearances appears to be in 1576, with the case of Bessie Dunlop, a farmer's wife accused of sorcery and witchcraft, as well as her association with said fairies. Upon the accusations against her, Dunlop claimed she'd found the whereabouts of the lost gods, and that she'd been given guidance from a former barony officer named Tom Reed, who had supposedly been killed 29 years earlier in the Battle of Pinkie. She would describe Tom Reed in great detail, and claimed while she'd never known the man while he was alive, she knew him now, given that he'd appeared to her when she was crying due to the loss of a cow which had died from illness under her care. As well as this, her newborn child was sickly, she herself weak from the exertions of childbirth, and her husband also had succumbed to an illness and was likely going to die. It's understood that Tom Reed aimed to lead her away from her life and away from Christianity so that she might join him at Downey Hill, otherwise known as the Court of Queen Elfame. However, Bessie Dunlop ultimately refused to join him, even when Tom Reed claimed that the Queen of Elfame had chosen her specifically, having been present when she was in labour under the guise of a stout woman. Thomas would go on to predict the death of her child, but also the recovery of her husband. Over his time knowing Dunlop, Reed claimed that the Court of Elfame was paradise, and that all she had to do was trade up Christianity for their ways. But again and again, he was turned down. Eventually, he appeared at her home with several men and women from the court who aimed to persuade her to join, but again, they were rejected. Dunlop would claim that they left with a horrible hurricane-like howl in the blink of an eye. On one occasion, Dunlop became aware of a group of riders passing by her home and vanishing into the lake. Reed would claim that these were fairies on a regular escapade on Earth. Regardless, neither Thomas Reed or the Queen of Elfame were around to help when Bessie Dunlop was seized by the authorities, strangled to death, and then burnt for witchcraft. Another account that took place according to the documents from the trial of one Alison Pearson in 1588, it claims that Alison was carried off to the Queen of Elfame's court on a number of occasions, and even became friends with the Queen. Though while she was acquainted with the Fairy Queen, she spent most of her time with the Queen's minions, who were described as elfin or elves. It's understood that Alison, with her cousin William Simpson, would become students of the elves and learn the art of healing using medicinal herbs. Alison would then take what she'd learned from the elves and would use it in her everyday practice, using it to heal her neighbours and bring comfort to those who required it. It hardly seemed ominous until Alison's account mentions that the elves would appear to her unexpectedly and would wake her up in the early hours of the morning, demanding that she join them in the picking of the herbs. When she refused, they became abusive and would strike her so hard that she would lose all of her strength, sometimes leaving her bedridden for several weeks. Alison Pearson was eventually burned at the stake for her dealings with the Queen of Elfhame and her minions, but also for prescribing cures she'd learned to others who were ignorant of her dealings with the occult. The Queen of Elfhame shows up again 10 years later, in 1598, where the trial of a man named Andrew Mann took place in Aberdeen. Andrew Mann confessed that when he was a small boy, he saw the devil, but that the devil took the shape of a beautiful woman, with whom identified as the Queen of Elfhame. His dealings with the Queen as a child appear to be benign in nature, and one account has him claim he received the ability to heal animals. In his account, he would go on to reference that the Queen of Elfhame was actually a married woman, and that she was married to a demon, or another form of the devil himself, named Christenday. Andrew Mann spoke vividly of one account where he rode alongside the Queen of Elfhame on white horses through the woods. Her husband Christenday appeared out from the snow in the form of a stag and joined them on their excursion before a host of human companions, all of whom appeared as if they were shadows, and began playing and dancing amongst them. It's claimed that Andrew Mann demonstrated supernatural abilities in that he was able to acquire the milk of a cow without even touching it. Further accounts of his relationship with the Queen of Elfhame being innocent are supported by the idea that he could summon an angel by uttering the word Benedicite, a blessing or grace in the religious community. There are also some inferences to Andrew being intimate with Christenday as well as the Queen. It comes as no surprise that Andrew Mann was burnt at the stake. A man named Marion Grant, who was said to be in the same coven as Andrew Mann, shared his beliefs and claimed that the Queen of Elfhame could appear as young as she wished and that she was a beautiful woman, clad in white. The accounts of Queen Elfhame don't appear to stop here though. They appear again over 60 years later in the case of Scottish woman Isabel Gowdie in 1662. Gowdie was accused of witchcraft after an early encounter with the devil, who she had arranged to meet at night. She would go on to name several others in this encounter and claim that the devil put his mark on her shoulder before proceeding to suck blood from it. She claimed to have had sexual intercourse with the devil on this evening, and that together with other witches, they danced all night long. Further claims state that she and her coven would ride on magical horses through the night, and at one point were entertained by the Queen of Elfhame in her court at Downey Hall, although the Queen also entertained water horses, or water bulls, which were mythical creatures in Scottish folklore that appear to be half horse with a regular body, but also with webbed feet and a whale-like tail. While her interactions with the Queen are unknown, it's quite compelling that many who were accused of witchcraft during this time would implicate the Queen of Elfhame in their confessions. While the Queen of Elfhame's existence is certainly cemented, well, at least in these confessions and these accounts, her origin is actually taken from an old legend revolving around the supposed Scottish prophet named Thomas Rhymer, or Thomas the Rhymer. The nature of these prophecies are not known, but it's understood that his poetic ability was so profound that he was often linked to that of the divine. But in literature, he appears as a protagonist in the ballad called Thomas Rhymer, where he is lured and carried off by the Queen of Elfhame, only to return with the ability to prophesize events. He also obtains a boon, or curse, that renders him unable to lie. In this, he often gains the nickname Thomas True, or the True Tom. Over the years though, this tale has been retold and alterations have since been made, some of which appear to embellish the role and the nature of the Queen of Elfhame, which may have served as some inspiration for those who were later accused of witchcraft to use in their own confessions. A brief outline of the ballad in question sees Thomas stumbled upon by the Queen of Elfhame in the woods, who is riding a horse. Thomas actually mistakes her for a queen of the heavens, or the Virgin Mary, for which she corrects him, identifying herself as the Queen of Elfhame. She appears to wear a skirt made of grass green silk and a velvet mantle, and it is implied that she is very beautiful and of a striking appearance. She beckons him to come with her, and when he does, she shows him the road to heaven, hell, and her own world, which he chooses to journey to. In some versions, the Queen dares Thomas to kiss her, and when he does, It is this kiss that gives her the power to steal him away to her own realm. While in this realm, Thomas is instructed not to speak to any of the other creatures. After 7 years, Thomas is brought back to the mortal realm again. Asking for a token to remember the Queen by, he's offered the choice of becoming a gifted harper or a prophet, the latter which appeals to him more. He's also granted a tongue that can tell no lies, as mentioned earlier. Whether or not the Queen of Elfhame actually existed in some capacity, and whether she was instrumental in the downfall of several witches in the Darker Ages, is up for you to decide. While the concept of fairies and a realm of fairies sounds absurd to us, it's interesting that at the time, many of the accused chose to implicate the Queen in their trials. Were they just making her up to use as a scapegoat? Or was the Queen of Elfhame actually a precursor to their downfalls? Do you think that the Queen was benign or evil? After all, in the case of Alice Pearson, it's her minions who harm her for her reluctance to abide by their whims, and thus, one may assume that their abusive nature is a reflection of their queen. In other cases, such as with Andro Man, the Queen of Elfhame is portrayed as good, given that the power she grants him allow him to heal animals. However, she also appears to be insidious in the fact that she lures him away and engages in sexual activity with him, despite having known him as a young boy. One might interpret this as grooming, in a sense, that she gained his trust very early on and acted under the guise of a benevolent entity before seducing him once he was old enough. In other cases, the Queen of Elfhame seems indifferent, like in the case of Isabel Gowdy, who seems to be present with Isabel in the court, but does not appear to have any real interaction or interest with her. This is also true in the case of Bassie Dunlop, whereby she does not appear to her at all, but supposedly operates behind the scenes, with the deceased Tom Reed serving as a conduit to convey her message to Dunlop to join her. In these instances, the Queen of Elfhame gives no indication as to whether she is good or bad. But let me know what you thought about the Queen of Elfhame, and whether you believe such a creature or entity could have possibly existed, or still exists today. Furthermore, would you join her court given the opportunity, even if you weren't entirely sure of what you were getting into? Would you play it safe and flee? Or would curiosity get the better of you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Until the next time, guys.